Surviving the Applewhites by Stephanie S. Tolan. Chapter 1. My name is not Edie. It's E.D. E period D period. What kind of a name is that? The boy slouching against the porch railing had scarlet spiked hair, a silver ring through one dark brown eyebrow, and too many earrings to count. He was dressed entirely in black. Black t-shirt, black jeans, black high-top running shoes, and the look in his eyes was pure mean. My kind, Edie Applewhite said. She had no intention of telling this creep the story of her name. She could tell by looking at him that he'd never heard of Edith Wharton, her mother's favorite writer. Being probably the only almost 13-year-old girl in the whole country named Edith, she had no intention of giving him even that little bit of ammunition to use against her. Edie, she thought, was at least dignified, like a corporate executive, which one day she just might be. What kind of a name is Jake Simple? Two can play at that game, the boy's face said. Mine. Not an original bone in his body, Edie thought. Just a plain, ordinary delinquent. According to her friend Melissa, though, Jake Simple was famous. He had been kicked out of the public schools in the whole state of Rhode Island. Melissa wasn't sure what all he'd done to achieve that particular distinction, but the word around Treybridge was that one thing he did was burn down his old school. He'd come to North Carolina to live with his grandfather, Henry Duggan, a neighbor of the Applewhites, and go to Treybridge Middle School. That plan had not lasted long. No one in living memory had been thrown out of Treybridge Middle School, but Jake Simple had managed to accomplish that feat in 3 weeks flat. At least the building was still standing. It was only the middle of September, and he had run out of schools that were willing to risk taking him. Mr. Duggan was inside at the moment discussing with Edie's parents, her Aunt Lucille, Uncle Archie, and Grandpa Zedediah, the arrangement the two families and Jake's social workers had worked out for continuing Jake's education. Jake Simple was the first person Edie had ever met who had a social worker. She thought that was probably only one step away from having a probation officer, which is what Jake's parents would have when they got out of jail. That was why Jake had a social worker, because his parents were in jail for growing marijuana in their basement and offering some to an off-duty sheriff's deputy. Edie didn't know how long they were going to be in jail, but at least a year. She figured criminal tendencies ran in families. The kid had burned down his school just after his parents were arrested. Edie's Aunt Lucille was a poet and had been conducting a workshop at Treybridge Middle School when Jake was kicked out. This whole terrible idea had been hers. She told Mr. Duggan about the Creative Academy, which was what Edie's father had named the Applewhite Home School. Only Aunt Lucille, whose view of life was almost pathologically sunny, would get the idea that after an entire state had admitted it couldn't cope with the kid, and after Treybridge Middle School had been defeated in less than a month, the Applewhites should take him in. The Creative Academy didn't even have any trained teachers, let alone guidance counselors and armed security guards. There were a whole bunch of buildings that a kid could burn down at wit's end. The main house, all 8 cottages, the goat shed, a tool shed, and the barn. But somehow Aunt Lucille had convinced everybody else. Edie had been the only family member to vote against letting Jake Simple join them. She begged her grandfather, who usually had more sense than all the rest of the family combined, to put a stop to the idea. "You know how Aunt Lucille can't ever believe a bad thing about anybody," she told him. "Her attitude about people is downright dangerous." He'd only twiddled his mustache and said that he rather envied Lucille's rose-colored view of things. More often than not, I've noticed, it turns out to be true. Then he had declared taking Jake Simple in a noble and socially responsible thing to do. Noble and socially responsible! More like suicidal, Edie thought. She had thought that even before she'd laid eyes on Jake Semple. Now she was sure of it. Jake pulled a cigarette out of a pack in his t-shirt pocket. Better not light that thing, she said, thinking about lighters and matches and very large fires. Wits End is a smoke-free environment. The boy reached into his pocket and pulled out a yellow plastic lighter. You can't have a smoke-free environment outdoors, he said. We can have it anywhere we want. This is our property, all 16 acres of it. Jake looked her square in the eyes and lit the cigarette. He took a long drag and blew the smoke directly into her face so that she had to close her eyes and hold her breath to keep from choking on it. Then he said one of Polly's favorite phrases. No one had managed to break Grandpa's adopted parrot of swearing. Edie suspected that they wouldn't have any better luck with Jake Semple.